Hey everyone, it's about 3 right now. We'll give everybody a couple more seconds to let everybody get in. Go ahead and get us kicked off. Greetings everyone, and thank you for joining us. Welcome to our second annual Field Inclusive Week. We are excited for you to meet our panelists momentarily. My name is Reagan McGuinn. I use she, they pronouns, and I am a recent graduate of NC State University with a degree in fisheries, wildlife, and conservation biology. I am also an intern for Field Inclusive, a young nonprofit working towards amplifying and supporting marginalized and historically excluded biologists and researchers who professionally work in the outdoors. Just so you are aware, today's webinar will be recorded and recordings will be posted to our YouTube channel throughout the week, so be sure you subscribe to us there for easy access to these recordings again. Shortly, I will introduce our panelists, but first I'd like to give a special thanks to our sponsor of Field Inclusive Week 2024, the Nature Conservancy. Thank you for coming on board as our sponsor for the second year and for being dedicated to promoting and supporting a more inclusive outdoors. It's through organizations like yours and the many individuals who donate to support Field Inclusive's mission that we can continue our goals in raising awareness when it comes to social field safety issues by hosting events like Field Inclusive Week, as well as providing financial support to marginalized and historically excluded individuals who professionally work outdoors. Now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's discussion. Putnam is a PhD candidate in the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she studies how components of climate change, such as increased temperature, are impacting marine organisms and causing changes in biodiversity through the loss of native species and the addition of invasive species. Allie is a first-generation college student, a mom to 2 kids, and is a disabled and chronically ill field researcher. She is passionate about the natural environment, advocating for inclusion and accessibility in STEM and higher education, and in fostering the next generation of scientists through research and teaching. Grace Casselberry is a fisheries biologist and postdoctoral research associate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, where she studies the spatial ecology of multiple shark species, shark interactions in recreational fisheries, and the effects of catch and release angling on striped bass. Broadly, Grace is interested in the intersection of marine animal movement, particularly migratory fish species, with fisheries management. Grace can be found curled up with a good book and a cup of tea, or outside exploring with Remy, her Irish setter puppy. A huge welcome and special thanks to our speakers today for agreeing to share their time and experiences with our audience members. Audience members, please feel free to submit questions for our panelists for the Q&A portion, which will be towards the end of our discussion today. Now, I'll pass it off to our speakers. And again, just to reiterate for our audience members, as you listen to the conversation, we invite you to please place your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar for our panelists to answer during the Q&A portion. All right, take it away, Grace and Allie.
Thank you, Reagan, for that introduction. And hi, everyone. Allie and I are really excited to get to be here today to talk about building accessibility into fieldwork. One of the reasons that this is really important is because in many natural sciences fields, fieldwork is the entry point to being able to get into these careers. And there's often an assumption that to be able to be a field scientist, you have to be a perfectly able-bodied individual. And these significant barriers can slow down or prevent entry to being able to get into these fields because we're using fieldwork at times as sort of a method of gatekeeping. But fieldwork can be accessible, and anyone that wants to participate in fieldwork should be able to participate in fieldwork. So today, Allie and I are going to talk about the challenges that fieldwork can present in the context of disability, as well as how we can make fieldwork more accessible for disabled researchers so that everyone can be included, supported, and accommodated. And one thing that we want to point out is that while we hope that there are disabled field scientists among us in this listening to this webinar, and that they feel seen and supported in what we're talking about today, we've largely designed this talk for able-bodied allies that want to create more inclusive field programs.
So we'd first like to introduce ourselves to you. My name is Allie Putnam. I use she, her, they pronouns. I'm a white woman with brown wavy hair in a black shirt, sitting in my daughter's red and black gamer chair. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst in the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program. I'm a marine ecologist, and I focus on intertidal invasive macroalgae and invertebrates and their interactions with native species and biodiversity, and how climate change may impact these interactions and overall biodiversity. I use a combination of laboratory experiments and field experiments, but spend a significant time out in the field surveying to get at all of these ecological issues. I'm a first-generation non-traditional student. I went back to college later on than others due to my health conditions and having my 2 kids. They've grown up in the lab and out in the field with me through my bachelor's, my master's, and now my PhD. I'm also a disabled scientist, which is the topic of today's talk. I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease over 15 years ago, which is an incurable autoimmune disease of the gastrointestinal system. It means I have a hard time with absorbing nutrients, have abdominal pain, fatigue, can have intestinal bleeding, urgency, and other non-gastro-related things such as joint swelling and pain, inflammation of my liver, eyesight issues, etc. I most recently was diagnosed with a central nervous system demyelinating disease, which is inflammation in my brain associated with my dysfunctional immune system. This is a little bit like multiple sclerosis, and I have symptoms that include loss of sensation in my hands, trouble with speech, connecting and speaking words that I see in my mind, but take a few moments to get out of my mouth, which might happen today during this talk as I'm due for my treatment on Friday. Finally, I have fibromyalgia, which is a widespread musculoskeletal pain, often joining fatigue. Basically, I'm tired and I hurt all the time. To manage my diseases, I'm on various medications. I've tried and failed most of the other lower level drugs available to me. And so I'm on strong biological immunosuppressant medications to shut down my immune system from attacking my own body. Unfortunately, this leaves me significantly immunocompromised, which you might imagine is challenging given that we are still experiencing a global pandemic. I have a set of photos here on the left to show you that on my best days, I'm out doing field work, sometimes carrying heavy loads, working in weird positions, as seen here where I'm using a rock hammer drill to drill into coastal bedrock, installing an experiment. And on my not so good days on the right, which actually happened to be in the very same day as this other photo, I'm hooked up to IV immunosuppressants and getting hydration. I consider myself an example of invisible illness. Many people who don't know me might look at me and think I'm your average person, but there's so much more happening under the surface, and it affects my daily life at all levels, from taking care of my kids to my fieldwork and scientific research.
And I'm Grace Casselberry. I also use she, her pronouns, and I am a white woman with brown hair pulled back in a ponytail, sitting in a very dark brown wood paneled room with a blue shirt on. I am a postdoctoral research associate at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and the vast majority of my research looks at shark movement ecology. So I use different kinds of electronic tagging techniques to track movements to better understand habitat use and residency in protected areas, interactions with recreational fishing, as well as broad-scale migrations. And I also am chronically ill. So I have a form of autonomic nervous system dysfunction called inappropriate sinus tachycardia. Basically, what that means is that my heart beats too fast all of the time. I pretty much run a marathon every day of my life, which, as you can imagine, is really exhausting. So I deal with fatigue. Something that affects me a lot in the field is heat intolerance. I'm more susceptible to getting tired in high temperatures, and also occasional bouts of dizziness. But I still get to do field work, which is wonderful. So I'm in the photos on the right here. You can see on my best days, I get to be out in the field tagging sharks. in beautiful places. And then on my not so great days, I'm in the lab analyzing data. The majority of my R code that I ran during my master's degree was run while I was also doing a 45-day Holter monitor, monitoring my heart rate to try to figure out what the heck was going on with my body. So one thing that we want to point out as we go through our talk today is that Ali and I both have invisible disabilities and chronic illnesses, but obviously we can't experience all types of disability. So we cannot necessarily speak with authority and in depth on every different kind of disability that's out there in the world. And what we're covering today, we're hoping to broadly describe many different types of disabilities and challenges in the field to bring awareness to the breadth of disability and challenges in fieldwork, and how we can do better to accommodate these things. But we aren't able to be all encompassing in this time.
And so we just, as we continue on in this presentation, we want to make it clear that there are many different kinds of disability, and that disability is dynamic in that the same illness or issue may be experienced very differently from individual to individual, and that a disabled person may have other identities that cross over or intersect with their disability, which makes their experience personal and different from person to person. So our discussion here is based on our personal experiences, what we've learned through self-education on these topics, and what we've learned from others. This is a starting point, and learning about this topic is ongoing. It's continuous. It's never static, even as disabled scientists ourselves. So in this presentation, we'll delve into field-based research, exploring the significance of accessible field research, addressing the complex aspects of disability. We'll discuss the challenges faced by individuals with disabilities, strategies for making accommodations, and we're going to try to provide you tangible examples of creating accessible fieldwork. Additionally, we'll emphasize the importance of effective communication, collaboration, training, and education in fostering an inclusive research environment. And then we'll wrap up with questions and discussion on these important topics.
So what are we talking about when we're talking about fieldwork or field-based research? I mentioned at the start of the talk that fieldwork is often this foundational pillar of a lot of the natural sciences fields that we work in. But there isn't really one good definition that encompasses all of fieldwork, because depending on what field you're in, your fieldwork can be very different, or within your field, the specific research questions you're asking can change your type of fieldwork. But generally, the things that all fieldwork has in common is that it's happening outdoors and away from the lab. You probably have to travel to get to your field site. Your field site might just be down the street if you're studying something like urban ecology in the community where you live, but you could have to go halfway around the world to get to your field site if you're working with animals in a remote area. One thing fieldwork also always has in common is dealing with uncertainty. So you don't have any control over the weather. You don't have any control over whether or not the animals that you might be working with are going to be where you think they're going to be when you get to your field site. And certainly we all who have done fieldwork know that things break spontaneously, and we're constantly trying to adapt. And so as field biologists, having to always be adapting and changing our plans for these uncertain conditions actually means that we can adapt really well to creating accessible spaces, because we're already always changing the plan, right? So why not include people that might need additional accommodations? In recent years, there's been increasing emphasis on the challenges that are faced in the field for historically excluded groups, and disability is included in that. So when we're talking about making fieldwork more accessible and why it matters, fieldwork is really an entry point in a lot of our natural sciences fields. And so we're using fieldwork as a gatekeeper to keep people out of these fields that maybe are interested in it because they feel like perhaps their bodies can't handle it or they don't belong. Instead of being proactive and using universal design in our fieldwork and making spaces where anyone can enter into these research fields. And this can kind of be further emphasized in graduate programs. So you may get through undergrad without having an expectation of doing a whole lot of fieldwork, but then you start looking at graduate programs and all of the labs you're interested in do field work, and how do you navigate that? Fieldwork often happens outside of the sphere of more traditional avenues of obtaining accommodations. So if you're talking about doing fieldwork in a university setting, universities have disability support services, but those people are often much more equipped to facilitate accommodations in a classroom setting. And maybe if you're lucky in a lab setting, but when you're talking about going out into the field, it can become really difficult for those people to be able to relate and help. And also disability can occur at any point in your life. So just because you're able-bodied now doesn't mean that something can't happen and change that situation. So for me, my chronic illness started when I was about 6 months into my master's degree, and it required a pivot and a re-looking at how I do fieldwork, but I was able to stay in the field because I had two really supportive advisors that believed in making fieldwork more accommodating for me. So just to sort of back up that statement about disability occurring at any time in your life, 57% of STEM workers that identify as having a disability, according to a recent NSF survey, are early to mid-career. So we're not just talking about making fieldwork more accessible for people that are in the latter half or the twilight of their careers that are more established. These are people that are trying to get their foot in the door in the field. And disabled workers in STEM are largely underrepresented compared to the broader population. So only 3% of STEM workers that were reached in this NSF survey identified as having a disability compared to 13% of the population.
So what is disability? The Americans with Disabilities Act defines disability as a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. However, disability is much more diverse, much more complex, and much more fluid than this definition. There are numerous types of disabilities that individuals may experience, including physical disability affecting mobility or bodily functions, cognitive disabilities influencing mental processes, visual impairments impacting sight, auditory impairments affecting hearing, invisible disability and chronic illness not immediately apparent, learning disabilities influencing information processing, storing, and retrieving, and instances where multiple disabilities intersect, creating a unique set of challenges. These are just general descriptions. There are many nuances and variations within these broad categories. Disability can occur at birth or be developed as a result of injury or trauma and even sickness. An example of this is the statistically significant mass disabling event that is the current occurring COVID-19 pandemic. Disability is intersectional, intertwining with an individual's other identities and parts of themselves. Disability is often multidimensional and dynamic in that the same disability can vary in severity and symptoms among individuals and can vary in severity and symptoms for that individual from moment to moment or day to day and across broad scales of time. My Crohn's disease impacts me differently today than it did last year, than it did 10 years ago. I didn't have a brain condition until most recently. My Crohn's disease and my brain condition are really different from others that I know with these issues. Disability doesn't tend to be one size fits all. So disability can be understood through various individual perspectives, but experts in disability studies have categorized these perspectives into broader concepts known as models of disability. And we'll discuss just a few of these models. The medical model places emphasis on the individual's physical or mental limitations and suggests that those with disabilities need to be quote unquote fixed. This model focuses on making individuals conform to societal norms through treatments and medical interventions based on medical standards. And on the other hand, the moral model associates disability with a person's character or actions, suggesting that an individual's disability is a consequence of something that they or their family did wrong at some point in their life. Both the medical and moral models are characterized by themes of shame, blame, and stigma. The social and cultural models of disability acknowledge that society creates barriers that impact individuals with disabilities. They emphasize that there is nothing inherently wrong with disabled individuals. Rather, it is society and societal barriers that disable them. We see in this image here on the left in the center saying people are disabled by the barriers, with arrows that are pointing at societal barriers listed, such as poorly designed buildings, inaccessible public transportation, limited job opportunities, social isolation, etc. However, by providing support, accommodations, and affecting changes in these societal structures, the daily living experience of individuals with disabilities can be significantly enhanced. To foster inclusion, society must undergo transformations by removing barriers, altering attitudes, and empowering disabled individuals. These models recognize the inherent value that the disability community brings to society and culture. In contrast to the previous two models rooted in shame and stigma, these models shift towards celebrating diversity and promoting inclusive practices. Considering these models in the context of fieldwork involves transforming the fieldwork culture to be inclusive of individuals with disabilities. So we transferred the previous image showing societal barriers to showing the society of fieldwork and the barriers in place in our own recreation. Some barriers include lack of funding for inclusive field projects, field sites chosen that are inaccessible, the hustle and grind culture of no breaks, work and publish or perish, assumptions about what disabled scientists can and cannot do and thus excluded, inflexible protocol, etc. However, by incorporating accommodations and integrating accessibility throughout protocols and all aspects of fieldwork, we can actively apply the perspectives of the social and cultural models. In essence, we're translating these models into practical actions, fostering an environment that recognizes and accommodates the diverse abilities of individuals participating in fieldwork.
So we're going to transition into talking about some of the many challenges that can be present as a disabled person attempting to do fieldwork. Starting out, we can talk about how there are literal physical barriers to being able to get into the field, and those can be in the form of the location where fieldwork is being done or the climate conditions where fieldwork is being done, and the mode of transportation to get to a field site. So when we're talking about things like rough terrain, that can be difficult for people with mobility impairments to traverse. For me, building in an extra day to just sort of get settled and organized, because my fieldwork requires long distance travel to get to my field sites, has been incredibly helpful. Making sure that housing accommodations can actually fit the whole field team so that everyone can get adequate rest can make a huge difference for people that deal with fatigue. And then also you want to make sure those accommodations are actually physically accessible to all bodies. So sorry, there was a delay on my end, I think. So moving on to more challenges, there can be difficulties with communication, particularly for people that have auditory processing challenges or deal with issues of sensory overstimulation. So you can imagine working in a really noisy environment like a tern nesting island might require accommodations from using headphones that can help drown out the noise, or also developing different ways to communicate with field members that can't hear as well. Challenges with low vision. I'm going to reference a book that's really excellent right now. It's called Uncharted. It's a collection of essays by disabled scientists. And there's a story in there by a researcher who deals with low vision issues that can't see well in low contrast environments. So during diving, they can't see the hand signals that are given that most divers communicate with, and obviously you're diving, so you can't talk. So they figured out a way to use physical touching signs to communicate with each other underwater. Fatigue and energy expenditure can be huge challenges with fieldwork. Obviously, for everyone, fieldwork is very physically taxing. And so making sure that we're developing a flexible field protocol that can allow people to take care of themselves. And then as Ali touched on, we're still in the middle of a global pandemic that's incredibly dangerous for immunocompromised folks, where even the regular common cold can be deadly for them. So developing protocols that deal with those kinds of health and safety concerns. If someone is sick, what do you do about your fieldwork? Do you have accommodations where that person can isolate away from the team? Things like that are important. And disability is dynamic and changes over time. One day in my body isn't exactly the same as the next. Years ago, I was much sicker than I am now. So those things can change over time. So being able to develop a flexible protocol is really important. There's also a dilemma of whether or not to disclose your disability or chronic illness. And we could give a whole talk dedicated specifically to the challenges of disclosure. But it's important to know that not everyone is going to disclose everything. And so the more proactive you are about developing accessible field protocols and developing a lab that is just supportive of each other and emphasizes teamwork in general, can mean that people will be more open to talking about what they need. And just because one person chooses to disclose to their supervisor, that doesn't necessarily mean that they've disclosed to everyone that they're in the field with, or vice versa. So when people have limited awareness or training on how to deal with these kinds of access issues, or they're not aware of it, just being proactive and developing accessible and universal design field protocols can help mitigate those issues. And there are concerns about disclosure, largely because there's a lot of stigma and bias about talking about what your body can and cannot do, particularly with field work. And often that can lead to an assumption that just because you can't lift a very heavy thing means that you can't do any of the field work. And that's not true. And I'm sure everyone can think of examples in their own field work of how people contribute in different ways. So as we move towards starting to make accommodations, I've already alluded to this big emphasis on flexibility in the field plan. So I think one of the most important things is to determine the needs of the team and communicate those to people very clearly. So the more clear your plan is, the more people that have disabilities or chronic illnesses are able to adapt proactively. So for me, if I know what I need to do that day, I can plan in the weeks and months ahead of that field schedule to get my body ready to be able to work in the field. So having that plan be really clear to everyone that's involved can alleviate a lot of anxiety. And then being able to, as much as you can, build in some flexibility. So if you're in the field for 2 months working on this project, you know that you're probably going to have some bad weather days and need some downtime. So building in those days where you can accommodate and take care of people's needs is important.
So field teams and allies should be aware of tangible tools and equipment that can support disabled field scientists. And these examples are valuable not only for allies, but also for those with disabilities looking to support their other disabled teammates. Grace earlier brought up an example of really loud birds turns while doing field work. My lab mate, Sarah Guitart, does field work out in these really loud field sites and has actually incorporated Bluetooth-enabled walkies and noise-canceling earbuds into her field gear to aid collaborators with hearing challenges, addressing the overwhelming noise of nesting terns. In loud environments, these tools can enhance communication and help manage sensory overload. And many of these tools are really inexpensive. Additionally, we can use adaptable data collection tools such as tablets, slates, and Braille note takers, which can both accept input or commands in Braille and output the result in speech and Braille, and talking tools that will verbalize colors, numbers, and text to support those with vision, hearing, and speaking impairments, which can create a more inclusive fieldwork experience. Toilet accessibility is important to all, but especially those with disabilities involving gastrointestinal, urinary, and/or gynecological conditions. For me, as a person with Crohn's disease, I'm astutely aware of the inherent embarrassment and even shame that folks like myself may feel when it comes to toilet needs. We should be providing access to toilet facilities to all in order to minimize these feelings and complications. Simple and low cost effective solutions such as travel toilets, waste storage bags, privacy tents, and essential sanitation items like tampons, pads, wipes, and sanitizer can offer privacy, alleviate stress, and contribute to a more inclusive and supportive environment. Oftentimes, fieldwork includes navigating challenging terrain, walking long distances, and carrying heavy gear. In addition to working with your team to spread the load to those who might be able to carry heavier items longer, we can use equipment to help. These images of mobility vehicles on the left come from a scientist who wrote a paper on making fieldwork more accessible through use of a repository system, which I'll talk about in a few moments. Herself, as a wheelchair user, identified some of these mobility vehicles as being important to navigating challenging terrain and to be purchased and used in an institutional repository system. Utilizing adaptive machines can really increase accessibility in certain places. Providing portable seating and tables for breaks, allowing individuals to rest without sitting on the ground is essential. And furthermore, employing tools like dollies and lifting equipment facilitates the transportation of heavy scientific equipment or samples with ease and functionality. Fieldwork often exposes us to challenging weather conditions, including extreme heat and cold, requiring us to work long hours with potential negative physiological impacts. Individuals with chronic health conditions may respond more intensely to these demands, making it really important to provide support. This support includes things like shade tents, constant access to cold water or ice, a variety of snacks, foods, and drinks, as well as things like glucose rescue items for individuals with diabetes. A well-stocked first aid kit goes beyond basic supplies, so beyond the 10 different types of Band-Aid shapes, but really needs to include things like NSAIDs or pain reliever, antibiotic ointment, antihistamines, antidiarrheals, etc. Many disabled individuals maintain a well-stocked backpack, serving as a personal emergency kit. Myself, I carry everything I need in case of an emergency for myself or for others. My field team jokes that I'm a walking pharmacy. However, sometimes I may use up everything and forget to restock, or I might grab the wrong bag. Accidents happen, but a team that is collectively prepared ensures that everyone is equipped to handle emergencies effectively, which promotes safety and well-being of the entire team and your disabled field scientists. So touching back on a term I used earlier when talking about mobility devices, equipment repositories. A recent article was published by Amy Charlotte Devitz in Integrative and Comparative Biology entitled Equipment Repositories for Accessibility, a model for improving access in field science. Here she lays out what an equipment repository is and how to put it in place for your institution, department, or organization. So basically, an equipment repository is a collection of accessibility tools, gear, and equipment, such as any of the items that I just listed over the last 3 slides that are available to use to improve accessibility and experience for disabled scientists. Many of you may be aware of the field gear closet that Field Inclusive runs, which provides items such as hiking boots, chest waders, and binoculars to those who need them. This is really similar to that. This repository provides items at no cost to the user and eases the financial burden of purchasing these items, which can be quite costly for some of these bigger like mobility tools. So the establishment of an equipment repository begins with identifying the specific needs of those who are in the given department or college that the equipment repository is serving. And this needs to be done in an anonymous manner. It's really important that people are not able to be identified and that they're able to just share freely what it is that they need in particular. So when you're putting this together, you focus on the needs that are identified rather than the medical diagnoses of the individuals when selecting the types of equipment to purchase. It's important to acquire funding, which can come in the form of buy-in from your university or your department, or through applying for and earning external funding sources. Long-term management of equipment repository includes creating a protocol for checking items in and out and keeping track of routine management, maintenance, and damages, in addition to continuing to search for funding to maintain and manage damaged equipment and continuing to buy items that may not be non-reusable. This can be a lot of work. So it's really important that the extra burden of this is not placed on disabled scientists to upkeep. This is where allyship especially comes into play. However, input and changes to the system need to be determined by the users, the disabled scientists and students of the equipment repository.
So an additional consideration, and a lot of what we've been talking about here today, is really just disrupting the hustle culture of fieldwork. So much of the work that we do in the field is done on really tight time constraints because funding is limited and we're always trying to do more with less. But a lot of the barriers that keep disabled folks out of the field can be broken down if we can get adequate funding to be able to do our field work, to fully staff our field team to the extent that we would like, and allow us to build a little bit of flexibility into our sampling protocols. Having policies to not attend field work when you're sick, or a way that sick individuals can isolate away from the rest of the group, is hugely important for protecting immunocompromised individuals, as well as anyone that may have an underlying condition that could be exacerbated by getting sick with something like COVID-19. And having accommodations that can provide adequate sleep for all of the members of the team is really important. We're really talking a lot about having policies that just promote self-care and taking care of all of the members of the team. There really isn't any glory in skipping lunch or not stopping to take a water break while you're doing your field work, even though often that can kind of be the attitude in the field. So building upon that, we can also start thinking about incorporating universal design into our field protocols. So if we think about the locations where we do field research, are there ways that we can incorporate field sites that are more accessible, especially for entry-level fieldwork jobs, people trying to get their foot in the door? You're not necessarily always going to be able to change where your fieldwork takes place depending on what your question is, but there may be options out there that can take place. And then if you can't change where your field site is happening, are there ways that you can harness new technologies to be able to make your fieldwork more accessible? For me, I use electronic monitoring devices that are anchored on the ocean floor to listen for my tags. A lot of times you have to dive to be able to retrieve those pieces of equipment. And I can't dive anymore because of my heart condition. People with my heart condition aren't allowed to dive. So using things like an acoustic release that makes my field gear float back up to the surface is a way that I can be accommodated in the field and still be able to do the field research. Things like aerial or underwater drones that allow for more remote transect lines and surveys underwater are other examples of technology that makes things accessible. And then I'm going to also harken back again to the book Uncharted. There's a really wonderful story in there that talks about a researcher who was hard of hearing, part of the deaf community, that participated in bird point count research, and they had a spectrogram app on their phone that translated the bird calls into visual sound waves so that they could identify the species that were being heard and still be part of the field team. And again, we'll just emphasize that always reassessing your protocol and your plans for fieldwork for ways that you can make them more accommodating and inclusive for all members of the team. And then we'll touch on the curb cut effect. So I emphasized a couple slides ago, the self-care is good for everyone on the team. That's basically what the curb cut effect is. Essentially, when we made curbs accessible for those in wheelchairs, people that don't use wheelchairs also benefit from that. So when we design accessibly, it makes things better for everyone. So we can improve fieldwork for the whole team by improving fieldwork for some.
So effective communication between disabled scientists and those in leadership positions, including academic advisors and project supervisors, is crucial for fostering an accessible fieldwork environment. As a project leader or advisor, proactive planning is essential. Incorporating accessibility into your protocol. Creating accessibility directly into your protocol needs to happen before you take on a disabled field scientist, not after a situation arises that puts an individual in a compromising or unsafe situation. In certain aspects we've discussed, if certain aspects that we've discussed already are not part of your considerations yet, now is the time to implement them. Integrating these elements help minimize the urgency for individuals with disabilities to disclose personal information. Not everyone may feel safe or comfortable sharing details about their disability, and by building inclusivity into your team's operations, you help alleviate these challenges. It's also important to be clear in your communication as a leader to your disabled teammates about the logistics of the research so that individuals can be prepared. We often have various factors to consider, such as medications, timing of medical procedures, and the potential physical impacts on our bodies. Providing all necessary information in a clear and concise manner is key. Moreover, being open to hearing the needs of individuals and making flexible adjustments demonstrates your commitment to creating an environment where everyone can contribute effectively. As disabled field scientists, open communication extends beyond project leaders or advisors, but includes our peers and teammates. So as a team leader, it's crucial to offer educational opportunities addressing issues that may affect team members, including field safety considerations for diverse identities, especially disabled teammates. The responsibility for education shouldn't solely rest on the disabled individual. Leadership guidance and team-wide education is critical. Privacy is also really important. Disabled field scientists may not want their whole team to know about their condition. So if information is shared by the individual to the leader or to other teammates, unless that individual has expressed consent, these things should not be talked about and privacy should be respected. Finally, it's important to include issues of accessibility into health and field safety plans. If you don't yet have one written and agreed to by your team, you need to develop a code of conduct, which includes explicit wording about discrimination and ableism. In your field safety plans, you should also include resources in local field site areas for disabled workers, ranging from locations and contact information for medical care to local support groups.
And it's really important to start thinking about these issues of accessibility early on. So the earlier that you start thinking about access and universal design in your fieldwork, the less that you need to scramble when needs arise. So not only does it support those with a disability, it can support someone on your team if their health conditions change over time. There's already a plan in place, and maybe nothing needs to change about how fieldwork is done to be able to keep this person as part of the team. And pre-planning also means that not everyone has to disclose if they would be uncomfortable disclosing. It gives people more power to be able to talk about their health conditions when they feel comfortable and ready to, because they're not forced into a situation where they need to talk about something that they're not comfortable talking about.
So as we wrap up here, we would like to leave a couple more nuggets of advice for allies who are looking to support disabled field scientists. It's so important to normalize disability in fieldwork. The phrase, "see yourself in STEM," applies here. Highlight the work disabled fieldworkers do as a standard practice and promote it where you can. Fund disability inclusive fieldwork. Purchase equipment that will be assistive. Fund research applications by disabled scientists. Support projects that involve disabled scientists and students. Do not make assumptions about what a disabled person can and cannot do. Remember, all bodies should be able to participate in fieldwork. Be empowering and enabling. Disabled field scientists often need to be creative and flexible to manage ourselves and our work. We also need you to be creative and responsive when issues come up. Actively listen and try to employ certain ideas or solutions identified by the individual instead of what you think is best, and collaborate with the individual to find solutions for success. Respect invisible disability. Just because someone looks able-bodied on the outside does not mean they do not struggle with other things. Believe a person when they share what they're going through with you. Don't assume anything, just communicate. Include disability in all JDIA work, in your work or academic institution. Disability is diversity. As we talked about earlier, disability is intersectional with all identities and therefore should always be included in justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility work. And finally, don't make decisions that involve disabled people without their voices being part of the decision-making. There's a phrase we use, nothing about us without us. So we have a list of great resources for continued learning on how to adapt fieldwork to be more inclusive. We'll put that link in the chat for you to check out. There's some great books like Uncharted, some websites to learn about how to use virtual research, and other ways to continue your learning on how to make fieldwork more accessible and inclusive for disabled and chronically ill scientists. And with that, we'd like to thank you all. We'd like to thank Field Inclusive for giving us the opportunity and the platform to talk about these issues, and to thank our audience here for learning with us, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
So much for that presentation. I'm gonna feed you a couple of questions from the chat, and audience, feel free to continue posting questions as we start answering them. So the first question is, what challenges or pushbacks have you faced when trying to advocate for more inclusive field opportunities for yourselves and or others?
Go ahead, Grace. You look
Okay,
like you're about to go.
Yeah, I think for me so far personally, the biggest challenge has just been having the funding to be able to do the job. So we're always trying to do more with less. COVID was particularly difficult because the field work that I did forced us to operate with a smaller field team than would have been ideal, which is hard on everyone's body, but was particularly hard on my body. What was fortunate was that my advisors are very conscious about making sure that everyone has enough space in the field accommodations. So even though I was bone tired by the end of the day, I did have a bed that I could come back and sleep in and recharge. So I think funding is tight for everyone, but funding for me is the biggest issue.
Allie, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Sure. Yeah, I would agree with funding. I mean, I think that's probably one of the biggest issues that many of us will face is the money to purchase certain equipment that would be more useful to us that might not be used by anybody else. Funding to have somewhere to stay, the ability to maybe have a couple extra days, which may cost more. So I think that funding, which applies probably everywhere, with all different issues in academia and science, funding is probably one of the biggest.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you for sharing. The next question is, and I believe this was touched on a little bit, but any advice for approaching these conversations with longtime field researchers who are stuck in the grind culture and don't think about these things on the daily?
Passive aggressive article emails. No, I'm kidding. That's a tough one. That's tough. I think recognizing that not everybody may be at a learning level that we would like them to be at. I think, by providing short articles that with compassion and kindness in how we communicate with those people to start to ease them into it. But I have met people that it didn't matter how kind and compassionate and gentle I was with them. It didn't matter. And so sometimes you just need to shout loudly.
No pressure, Grace. Is there anything you'd like to
Yeah,
add? I don't
no,
want to repeat.
I mean,
I
I
don't want to
think
make
that
you
was
answer if you don't want
that
to,
was
but
great, but I would also add that sometimes, though it's not the ideal way, if you can work in some other reason why slowing down might be a good idea. So often, most of my work is in tropical environments as well, so it's very hot. So hydrating and taking water breaks is really important for me personally to keep my blood pressure up because that's something my body struggles with. But also, like, nobody wants to get heat stroke. So I emphasize with my field teams, like, hey, okay, we just tagged this shark, we're letting it go, let's drink some water. We're going to drink some water because that's really important for everyone. I don't want to have to deal with me if I pass out, and I don't want to have to deal with you if you pass out. So if there are ways that you can work the slowing down in as a benefit for all, that might be a softer introduction.
absolutely. That's a great point. Thank you. Our next question is, have you ever been asked to prove your hidden disability? How did you handle the situation? And how do you recommend others respond to a situation where they are asked to prove their disability or need for accommodations?
That's incredibly difficult. It's also illegal, I think, depending on who it is that's asking you. But that's not my area of expertise, so don't directly quote me on that. But I don't think that people can demand a medical diagnosis proof from you. I've not been asked to do that before in a field context, so I can't directly speak to that. I did have to do it to be able to get my parking pass on my university campus when I wasn't able to walk from the parking lot that they wanted me to be walking from. I needed a doctor's note, which made me feel like I was 7 years old missing second grade. So I can empathize with that, and I'm really sorry. That's a super difficult situation.
Yeah, I have not had that happen in a field context, but I have always worried about it. So the way that I've managed my anxieties around that is to work with like our disability support office at our university, which doesn't give full protection to graduate students, out in research and working situations, but I felt like that was a great place to at least like say, well, you can have my documents because I mostly trust you, but then you can advocate for me. But it should never be that that you are asked to prove your disability. And I think that if someone were to ask me to prove my disability, I would say, no, you don't deserve to know those things about me. But that is a risky thing to say, because you could say that and then a person might say, well, then I don't want to work with you. So there are really, like Grace mentioned earlier, the issues about disclosure. We could have a whole week-long discussion about disclosing about your disability, the safety or lack thereof that might be there for certain individuals, for any individuals. And it is really a very complicated and hard topic.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for those points. This next question is accompanied by a story. I'm going to paraphrase a little bit. Essentially, what happened is this person is sharing with permission. A friend of theirs was exposed to Lyme disease during their studies, and the existing symptoms of Lyme disease did appear, and they were told to switch majors and find a different career path. Due to the rigor of field work, this was really isolating, and made them feel very defeated. They still graduated in their original major despite this, and did find another professional sphere due to the lack of institutional support and traditional job demands. They're happier in their new career, but it was a challenging decision. And so the question associated with this is, what advice do you have for people facing similar pushback to disability inclusion? What was most useful for each of you in advocating for personal needs and finding support? And how do you balance visibility and vulnerability when expressing you are disabled? What changes have you seen in your industries or fields that give you hope? That's a lot of parts, but feel free to answer what speaks out most to you, and it is in the Q&A if you need the rest of the story.
Yeah, I'm so sorry about that person's experience. It makes me feel all types of feelings. And I'm glad that they found something that worked for them, but it shouldn't have had to be like that. So for me, I am really outward and loud about my disability. Maybe it's because I'm the oldest child. We just always have to be like loud and organizing things, and that's how I am. And I'm a mom too, so I'm always really forward about myself and what I've got going on for myself. And when I meet people that push back against that, or who are not accepting, it's painful to see because it feels unfair. But then I tell myself, like, this is not a place that I want to be. This is not a place that like, I've got goals, and this is not going to help me get to my end goal. And so this is not a place that I want to stay. And so, like, I have had to make changes in my own PhD because of that, and have had to search for individuals who are those allies, who will support me, who will also be, who maybe are in positions of power to push back against that. So, like, I think about the various folks at my institution in our DEI committee, and we talk loudly about disability, and they try to work towards bringing change. I bring these things up with my advisor, and she is the one who has been the most supportive of my disabilities and accommodating. And I would say that, if I didn't say no to those other situations that were not a good fit, then I would have put myself in risk and at risk for harm over a long period of time. And I wouldn't have ultimately found the person who was supportive, and brain, who is that advocate. So it's not easy, though, to find those people. So, like, the people who are on this call who do want to support disabled scientists, like, we need you to be out in front and visible to the people like us who are in your sphere, so that we can identify who you are and go, oh, that's the person who might be able to help me and hold that door open for me.
Yeah, I think everything Ali said was a great answer to that. It hurts my heart to hear that story. I also was told to leave my field by a doctor when I was in the thick of the initial onset of my illness. My heart condition manifested somewhat catastrophically, and I didn't have a whole lot of choice about whether or not I was going to disclose, because I ended up in the hospital for multiple days in the middle of the spring semester. And so I had to tell people, but it is a very scary thing. And I was fortunate that I found myself purely by luck in a soft place to fall in the lab that I had chosen before I had any kind of concerns and health conditions. And so I think what Ali said about allies is really poignant. If we can have these people who are able-bodied and passionate and talking about how these issues are issues, that takes a lot of the burden off of those of us that are quite literally sick and tired.
Absolutely. Thank y'all for that. And thank you for sharing that story to the person that did post that. And I'm quite sorry that that happened to your friend. The next question is a little bit similar, in the same situation with chronic Lyme disease. I will say, I'm gonna stop real quick. It is 4 o'clock, so if you do need to hop off, by all means, feel free to do so. To our attendees, the rest of this will be posted on YouTube. The entire thing will be, so feel free to catch the rest then if you need to. But if it's okay with y'all, we'll continue with some questions if y'all have the time to do so. Perfect, thank you. So this next question, this person also has chronic Lyme disease and remembers back to undergrad when they were called into the professor's office and questioned whether or not they're actually able to do the research he had hired them to do for that summer, because the professor had heard from someone else that this individual had Lyme disease. This person says, I remember feeling like the floor had been pulled out from underneath me and how unfair it was that he was questioning my abilities based on something somebody else shared without my permission. I almost quit science that day. I left his office after, not sure what I said to him, and cried in the bathroom. What would you tell to a young scientist who is faced with a similar situation? How can you advocate for yourself if you're being questioned about your ability to complete work? To this attendee, I'm so sorry that that happened to you. I hope that we can have some good answers for you.
Yeah, that's really awful. Something that I say out loud a decent bit, but also say to myself a lot, is that no one knows what I'm able to do better than me. People with chronic illnesses and disabilities spend every minute of every day of their lives managing these illnesses or these conditions. So we're constantly thinking about whatever specific thing we need to be thinking about to be able to go through the world. And I think it's very unlikely that someone is going to sign up for something that they know deep down in their core that they absolutely are never going to be able to do. So to have someone make that assumption is just purely based in the fact that like they don't know what they're talking about. They don't have very much experience with people that are sick, because why would we want to do something that's going to make us miserable all the time, right? Or set ourselves up for failure. It's really challenging when you're in a situation like that where you're an undergrad talking to a professor. Like that's a huge power dynamic, and it's incredibly difficult to stand up for yourself in those kinds of situations. As I've progressed in my career, it gets a little bit easier. Not that it's ever that easy. There are still power dynamics, but it's a little bit easier for me to advocate for myself. As you get older, you get a little bit more confident in yourself. But yeah, I'm really sorry that that happened, and just know that you know yourself better than anybody else.
I don't think I can say it any better than Grace just did, other than that I do want to also say I'm really sorry about your experience, and that you didn't quit science. I'm so glad, and because science needs you, so.
Absolutely, I completely agree. And Grace had to write down what you said. That was really great and something I need to hear myself. Our next question is, your point about don't make decisions without disabled people makes a lot of sense to me. What would you do if people in your community aren't disclosing, or people with disabilities aren't there because of historical exclusion?
I would say the internet is a great place, the internet and the library. So learn, you yourself learn then. If you don't have anybody who is stepping out and disclosing their disability, and there are not a lot of people with disability in your sphere, then we need you to take some time to educate. There are plenty of resources online, which hopefully the resources that we sent out today will help people do some more self-educating. But learning is really important, because when you learn, then you can advocate. And starting a conversation, just have that conversation with whatever, DEI group that you may be working in, or your department, faculty department meetings, or your student organization meetings. So self-education and get the conversation going.
Great. Thank you for sharing. I completely agree. And yes, that resource page should be in the chat, and we'll send it out later as well. Our next question is using an example. This person has been in positions that are very intense in the field, high heat, 104 degrees, carrying heavy equipment, walking long distance, or just a few. This person has run into the issue of people thinking or believing they can handle the conditions when clearly they could not. What would you do in those situations? This person is worried and has been worried about people's health in being in intense conditions they cannot handle. I worry that people do not know their limitations, and because of that, they don't know how to communicate what they need. What is the best way to go about handling this situation and being sensitive and respectful?
This is such a great question. Thank you so much for asking this. I really think that a lot of this can come down to like the culture of your field team environment and the leadership. So in my laboratory with my PI, Dr. Michelle Staudinger, over at UMaine, before we started our whole field season, our field team spent time creating a field safety plan. If anybody wants access to that template, by the way, feel free to shoot me an email. I didn't think about it until now that I could have probably just given you all an example of it through this presentation. But we went through our field safety plan document. We wrote up a code of conduct. We had discussions about how we set the tone of our research, which is that people are first and research is like short second. And so the things that we need to do are to always be looking out for each other, to build in breaks, to have conversation about, check in with each other about how we're doing. And that was the tone that was set by the supervisor, and then myself as the field leader with our team of like eight or so students. Like my leader made me feel like, yes, this is great. And then I made sure our team was aware and continued to check in, have conversations, and set the tone with our undergraduates. We said, this is how we operate as a team. And then that is how we operated as a team. I mean, granted, nothing is ever like 100% perfect, but I would say that like this past field season was one of the most successful field seasons for our team. And then even for me as a person who really struggles with heat as well, and being out on islands in the middle of Boston Harbor with no transportation in the middle of a heat wave. Like I fully get that. And so I would say that it starts at the top. And so you need to have those conversations and set the expectations and set the standards, and be reminding people that those are the standards.
Yeah, I think that was excellent. The only other thing that I would add is making sure when you're building your field team. So I don't know if you hire seasonal folks, but being really clear about the needs, like the actual needs of the position in the job ad, so that you are getting people that know what they're getting into, because certainly working in 104-degree heat, that's really intense. So making sure that people are aware of what they're getting into before they get into it, I think is really important.
Great points. Thank you. I believe this next question has been answered in previous questions, so I'm going to go ahead and skip to, just for the sake of time. This next one, doing the field tech circuit means I have to travel across the country for different jobs. Do you have any recommendations on finding a doctor who can help you navigate your illness and set you up for success while doing field work?
I just am like the thought of having to change doctors every time you relocate to a new field site is like making my skin crawl in terror. I can totally empathize how hard that's so hard, especially when you start getting into more involved diagnoses that need even more specialists than just the general specialist. I don't know that I have great advice other than if at all possible, when you find a doctor that you really connect with, especially if you have a condition that maybe you only need to see them twice a year, if you have the means to be able to travel to continue seeing them and they would be open to that. I think that that would be an important conversation to have. I'm as a postdoc, at some point, I'm going to be taking on a new position, and the idea of moving and maybe having to find new doctors when I've finally found good doctors is like, I hate that idea. And it would definitely be a conversation that I would be having with my doctors if I were to need to move away.
Yeah, I just agree having those conversations with your doctors. I don't travel across the country, but I'm in New England and I live in the middle of Massachusetts, but I'm a marine scientist who needs the ocean. So I work down in Long Island Sound in Connecticut. I work in Narragansett Bay in Rhode Island, and I work out in Boston Harbor. And so I travel in the sense that sometimes I'll go away for a few days, and I will have issues that arise, but I've been pretty open with the doctors that I've found that have been good doctors that I've held on to. And I let them know that I'm a field researcher, like I travel, I'm out in nature and blah, blah, blah. And all my doctors have always said, like, if you need anything, like, give me a call. So I think building relationships with certain doctors and being upfront about, like, I told my doctor, I was like, you are one of the best doctors I have ever had. When you leave this practice, I would like to follow you. And I will need to speak with you at other times that, like, maybe like I'll be the first one to call you when I've got a problem. And he's like, I'm ready. When you just call the office and I'll deal with whatever you've got going on, wherever you may be at the time. It's not always like that though, because the medical field, it's really hard to find good doctors, if I'm being really honest. So I may make it sound great, but like it took me like 6 years to find this guy.
Absolutely. I completely understand. Thank y'all for your answers. This last question is, I had a difficult field experience 2 years ago and realized now that if I had disability accommodations, I probably would have had a much better experience. I haven't worked for that organization since, but would you recommend that I reach out and communicate that they should work to incorporate accessibility into their protocol?
I think if it's something that you would feel comfortable doing and there's someone that you feel safe having that conversation with, certainly there's nothing like, if those conditions are all available to you, then all that you would be doing is helping future people. But there's obviously concerns about disclosure and talking in a space that maybe isn't as safe, and there could be career repercussions, unfortunately, from that. So you'd have to weigh the pros and cons there and determine whether or not you feel like it's a safe thing to talk about. But
I agree with that totally.
Absolutely. All right, well, that is the last question. I really appreciate y'all staying a little bit longer to answer those. Y'all had some really, really great responses. So while we were out of time today, so on behalf of Field Inclusive, I would like to thank Allie and Grace once again for joining us today. And we thank you for the work that you are doing and continue to do when it comes to being an inspiration to others in the natural science field and for sharing your experiences. Again, we thank those of you who joined us today. We will continue these conversations as we further our initiatives and work when it comes to amplifying social field safety issues, as well as amplifying minorities in STEM. Please be sure to follow and interact with us on all of our social media channels, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at the handle @FieldInclusive. Please also be sure to visit our website to learn more about our organization and ways that you as an individual or organization can support us. Be sure to check out the rest of our virtual Field Inclusive Week events, and be sure you're following us on social media to hear about and enter our daily giveaways. There will be no webinar tomorrow, but we do have a fun Fieldwork Fashion Show social media challenge for participants for a chance to win a $100 Duluth Trading Company gift card. We will resume webinars on Friday at 10 a.m. Eastern, where we will hear from Michaela Brister, dedicated conservation professional focused on sustainable agriculture, Lee Bergassa, 20-year veteran of Raleigh Parks with a focus on horticulture and natural resource conservation efforts, and Abby Thiemke, carnivore ecologist and human-wildlife conflict expert, who will all make up our feminine or field safety or FEM field safety panel. We hope you all enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you again for joining us.